Hey guys, Steph the Illuminated Nerd here. Today's part 3. I'm building a NAS and Plex Media server using a Node 804. So far we've built the server and now we're going to install the Unraid operating system and configure it with some of the more popular Docker containers. So let's get right into it. The suggested method to install Unraid is to install it on a USB stick, and 2.0 is preferred over 3.0 because of compatibility and reliability reasons. The stick should be between 1 GB and 32 GB, but I'd say 8 and 16 is currently the sweet spot with what's available. It must have a GUID, which is a unique ID that's tied to the USB key, and this is required in order to make it a bootable hard drive that the license key can be tied back to LimeTech. And if you're plugging in your USB key on the outside of your case into an I/O panel, then you should get a small form factor key because you don't want to bump into it accidentally. So these SanDisk Cruiser fits are pretty ideal sized. If you do have a USB port on your motherboard or a connector that would allow you to use a little adapter so that you can put your USB key in your motherboard, out of sight, out of mind, that would of course be preferable as well. Once you have your USB key available, you're going to put it in either a PC or Mac computer and open up a browser to unraid.net/download. You're going to then, in this orange box, click on either download for Mac or download for Windows to get the USB creator software. I have Windows, so I'm going to click on download for Windows. And then once it's done downloading, I can run this software. And I actually already have a copy of it running here. And the only thing you want to change is by clicking on this customize button. You have the ability to change the server name, which is good because you're going to be able to access your server through a web browser from any computer in the same network as your Unraid server, which is why you don't need to have a monitor or a keyboard and a mouse for your server. You're just going to put it somewhere in a corner, attach a network cable to it, power it up, and voila, you're going to be able to access that server with this server name. The default is Tower, but I'm actually going to change mine to Borg and leave the network mode to DHCP. If you have some sort of like issue where you want to use a static IP, you can do that here and actually specify what your static IP is going to be for your server, but you can just leave it to DHCP and your server is just going to assign an internal IP and you're going to be able to resolve that server's internal IP by using its internal server name. Allow UEFI boot is if you have a more modern motherboard that has a UEFI BIOS. There are some motherboards that only have a UEFI BIOS, some of the more recent ones. So if you're in that case, you absolutely have to check that checkbox. Or if you have a modern motherboard where you are running a UEFI BIOS, you can check that checkbox. I would say the majority of the motherboards kind of support both still, where you have the ability of putting it in legacy BIOS mode or UEFI boot. You have to change that in your BIOS depending on which one you prefer, depending on your needs, but I actually have mine set to UEFI. And so I'm going to click this checkbox and I'll show you in the BIOS later how I have that set up so that it uses UEFI. And then that's it. You're just going to make sure that you have your USB drive selected and you're going to click on right here and you click yes. And then that's going to download Unraid and it's going to format that USB key and it's going to install Unraid on that USB key. Once it's done, take your USB key, plug it into your server, boot up the server. So as your server starts booting up, you're going to want to enter the BIOS, which it will tell you what key you need to press. You can see it's delete for me. It's often my F2 as well. So get into your BIOS and then we can go to the boot section. And then I'm going to set my boot mode to UEFI because I said I have a UEFI BIOS. I actually have both on my motherboard, but I am going to set mine to UEFI because I checked that checkbox for the installer. And then I'm going to change the boot order so that my USB key is the first one. And then I'm just going to go to the Save and Exit tab and get that server to boot up again. And now this time it's going to boot Unraid from the USB key and give me this little boot menu, and I'm going to pick the first option because that's the default, and all that's going to do is boot up into Linux and just kind of sit at the login prompt at the end. So here's where you can just turn off your server or disconnect it from a monitor and just shove it in a corner, and then you're going to be accessing that server from your browser just like this. So now your server's booted up and you want to be able to remotely administer that server and configure it now. You don't need to touch the server itself once it's actually booted up at the login prompt. So you can open up a browser in any computer that's in the same network as your server. So you would then want to go to http:// the name that you gave your server when you were using your USB creator tool. I called mine Borg, so I do http:// Borg, hit enter, it reaches the web admin console for Unraid, and that's what you're going to use going forward to administer your Unraid server. First screen that comes up is you need to get a trial key. You can get a 30-day free trial to try out Unraid to see if you like it. The trial key has an unlimited number of storage devices, but when you if you go to purchase a key, you have to pick between 3 different tiers of licenses depending on the number of storage devices, which it shows here. It says my server has 7 right now. So I'm just going to click on Get Trial Key. Say yes, click trial, and that's it. You click OK. It ties your trial to the unique GUID of your USB key, which is why your USB key requires a unique GUID so that you can attach the license to it. So here we are in the main screen now, and this is where you're going to assign your drives to Unraid, and then you can start your array. Actually, I'm going to get rid of this system notifications are disabled thing. Just click here. Just enable them, and you can just leave the rest default. It just means that by default it's going to show the notifications in the corner of your browser when you're in the web panel. You can make it so that it sends you emails and whatnot, but I think that's unnecessary, so just click apply, done, and go back to the main section like you were. So here we are. You can see that it asks for, in your array you can assign parity drives and you can assign like data storage disks. A parity drive is going to be used to recreate your data drive should one of your data drives fail. If you have one parity drive, you can have one data disk fail and you'd be able to recover it no problem. If you have 2 parity drives, you can have as many as 2 data disks fail and expect that the array will be able to rebuild your data disk without losing any data. So I'd say that's a pretty rare circumstance. I actually just am going to use 1 parity disk for my setup. The one thing that you have to realize, or that you have to take note of, is that your parity disk must be as big as the biggest data drive that you have in your network. So all of my data drives are actually 3 terabytes. So I'm going to have 1 3 terabyte parity drive and 3 3 terabyte data drives that I'm going to assign. So that does mean that I lose that 3 terabytes from one of the drives, and then my total array storage size will be 9 terabytes, but I have that sort of safety net that one of my data drives can die and I can still recreate that data without expecting to lose it. That's not a perfect backup solution either. You should still have an additional daily backup that's offline from your Unraid server, but maybe I'll show you guys how to do that later. So scrolling down, we have cache devices. You do want to have a cache device, but it's not required. You can run with just your data drives. What that means is that once you start copying data to your shares, if you don't have a cache drive, it's going to write directly to your mechanical drives, which they're actually kind of slow, so it can take a long time when you're uploading to your data drives. So by using a cache drive, you can use a fast SSD, or I actually have an NVMe attached here that I'm going to use for a cache drive. When I write to that cache drive, I'm going to get that full NVMe speed, and then once a day, Unraid is going to take any of the data that was written to the cache drives, and then it's going to copy it to your mechanical RAID array. So that's good. That means that you can write at your full write speed of your SSD or your NVMe, but still have the ability to build a large data array with cheaper mechanical disks. You can have more than one cache device. If you set up a second cache device, it will actually create a RAID 1 array of the 2 cache drives, so it'll do like a perfect mirror of the 2 drives. So if one of the 2 cache drives fail, you'll have that other cache drive, so you don't take the risk of writing to your cache drive on day 1 and losing that data in between writing that data to the drive and when the process is going to run later that night to copy the data to your data array. I'd say that's not a big requirement, because if you copy your data to, let's say, your NVMe drive, just wait a day before you delete that data on your original location before you expect it to show up on your mechanical disk, so then you're more safe and whatnot. So, but you can still obviously add a second cache device. So here we are. Now that means we've configured our array, and then all you're going to want to do down here is click on the start button to start the array. Now this is going to start a parity. Yes, now this is going to start like a parity check, and the parity check is actually a really long thing. It does depend on the number of hard drives that you have and the size of the hard drives. So you see, for me, it's going to take almost 5 hours. So it does depend on the number of drives and how big they are. So anyways, you can wait until all of your parity is done. So now after you've gotten your drives set up in your dashboard and that you've assigned your drives to your array, in this main section, you're going to want to click this checkbox, which will format in all of these disks that are saying unmountable, unsupported partition layout. You just want to click this checkbox here and click on format. This will get all of those drives ready to be usable by Unraid. Pretty simple. You just got to wait for it to be done. So here we are in the shares section. We're gonna start by just doing the basic, simple single share that accesses all of your data, and that it's the path of least resistance. Unraid is set up with no security by default, so let's just kind of go with that, and then I'll do a section on security towards the end so that you can see how I have my setup. So here we are in shares. I'm going to add a share, and I'm just going to call it media. And that's going to be my share that's going to have like all of my TV, all of my movies, all of my projects. So it's going to have everything, and it's going to do that by just having subfolders underneath that media share, right? And then allocation method high water. So what that means is that it's choosing how it's going to copy files to all of your different data disks. So of course you're copying to your cache drive initially, but once it's actually going to start taking that information from your cache and move it to your actual RAID array, sorry, it's not actually a RAID array, it's just an array. It's then going to decide which disks to put your data on. And high water generally means it's just going to start throwing files on a disk, and when it hits a reasonably full amount, then it's just going to start switching to the next disk and just try to like evenly distribute that content across all of the disks that you have allocated to your disk. Minimum free space. If you ever want to know about all of these areas, all of these like fields here, if you click on the field, it'll actually explain. See, it says here, high water, choose the lowest numbered disk with free space, and then it'll just keep switching from disk to disk so that it tries to like evenly fill the disks out. And then fill up could be like, fill up is basically fill up one disk before you move to the next disk, but it should have the minimum free space available. So let's say you put it to like 500 megabytes, then it'll fill the disk until there's only 500 megabytes free, and then it'll move on to the next disk. So that's the combination using allocation method and minimum free space if you're using the fill up option. And split level says something along the lines of, if you have a TV show that's a certain number of layers deep down into your folder structure, and you want all of the files of your TV show to always be in the same disk as opposed to like splitting it out across a whole bunch of disks, then the split level allows you to override that allocation method. So the split level will always take priority over the allocation method. This is hard to use and set up with a big single share, because then that split level will actually apply to your entire share, which is the reason why I actually use multiple shares, one just for movies, one just for TV, and one for my projects. So I'll show you guys how to do that way later and explain why the split level matters for that kind of a setup, but it actually doesn't matter if you're just going to use a single share. And then moving on, included disks. Because you're just doing a single share, you're just going to include all, which is the default, and say, I want all of my data disks in my array to be part of this one share. So I want all of my data disks to be in the share. I just want the one share called media, and I'm just going to copy files to folders within that share, and I don't really care how it gets put into that share as long as I basically have a very, very large amount of data storage, and that Unraid kind of like takes care of it from there. And this is, like I said, the easiest, simplest way of doing it, because it's very much a set up and forget method. You just set this up once with your media share, and you know, if there's no hardware issues, you should just be good to like never have to like touch Unraid. You should just be okay with your shares, right? A couple of these options. So for example, use cache disk is if you're copying to that share, you can actually make it so that it only stays on your cache disk. If you put no, it actually means that it'll bypass the cache disk and put your data directly onto your array. And that's the default. And it's like, okay, I don't want that. I actually want my files to go to go to the cache disk. Right here, let's look at the option. It says no, prohibits new files and subdirectories from being written onto the cache pool. So then new files and subdirectories are directly going to be written to the array. Yes indicates that all new files and subdirectories should be written to the cache pool, provided enough free space exists. And if there's insufficient space on the cache pool, then new files and directories then get created to the array. So you don't have to worry about like running out of space on your cache drive. When the mover is invoked, which you usually run once a day, and we can set that up. Usually it's like around 3 a.m. that it runs. Files and subdirectories are then transferred to the cache pool and onto the array. So like that's, the yes is really like the way that we want it to run. Now if you use the only option, it means that your files will only get copied to the cache and the mover will ignore them and not ever copy them to the array. The prefer says it should, so prefer means, so yes means it'll write to the cache and then move to the array. But prefer means that it'll write it to the cache unless there's insufficient space, then it'll write it to the array. And when your mover is invoked, it will then grab a copy of what's in your array because there was insufficient space, and then it'll transfer it back to the cache pool. That's a bit of a... lots of great options, but that's probably not a use case that fits for most people's circumstances. So I'm just going to add this share as is. Now, the way I set it up, single share, media, no problem. Now, after you've added, when you scroll down to the bottom, it now starts to add like a security settings. The default is actually that it should set the drive to public security, which means that anyone inside your network will be able to see the share, will be able to access and write to that share. And the export yes, that's the, I want this drive to be shown on the network when you browse the server. If you put it to no, it'll be hidden. Or if you put it to no, that drive is not available at all. Yes, it's available and you can see it. Yes, hidden means that the drive, the share is available, and if you know the name of the share, you can access it through the network, but it's not going to show up when you go browse your server and say, I want to see all the shares there on that server. So you wouldn't see the media share when you go browse the network. And I'm going to show you that in a second. So anyways, by default, it's set to export yes, and the security is set to public. Now, if you set it to like private, you can then make it so that it requires users, and I'll actually be doing that later because that's how I have mine set up. But here we go. I'm just going to leave the defaults and then click done. So now we have a media share. It's public. It's set to use all the disks, so it says it's going to use all of my 9 terabytes, and it's just going to allocate the files and data as it pleases, and we don't have to worry about anything until hard drives start to get full, and that we want to start adding more hard drives if we want to make our array larger. So here we are. We now have a share. Let me show you how to access that share and be able to like write stuff to the share. Because at this point, because we're not using any users in security, I said this was like the easiest way of doing things. My Unraid has no security. You can access it just by hitting the web browser with no password. Same thing with your shares. Everything is set up as public access. This is the easiest way of doing it. Probably not the most recommended way, but I digress. So here I have, I went to, here's my my network section, and then you can see all of the computers that are in my network here. And the name of my server, as I've said, was Borg. Enterprise is the current computer that I'm recording on. And so if I click on this Borg computer, it's going to show all of the shares that were set to like export non-hidden, which you can see matches. You can see it matches what's here on the left. Here's are all the name of the shares. Here's my new media share. And I can go browse to that media share, and voila, now I can start copying files to that share. I can make folder structures, TV, media, whatever I want, projects, and I can just start copying files to that. And it's very much a set up and forget type of remote network storage system. So there you have it. That's really the easiest way of getting your shares set up. I will be showing you a more complicated version though. So let's move on to that. If you just tried to set up a single share and you don't see in your network your server, or you do see your server, but then when you double click on it, you don't see any of your shares, you probably have your Windows 10 configuration incorrect, or it's missing a few settings in order for that to work correctly. So fast forward to this timestamp, and I have like a troubleshooting section that will explain a few of the steps that you can take to ensure that that does work correctly, so that you see your server and that you see your shares, and because you're going to want to map your share to simplify your life anyways, and you really need that set up correctly in order to do that. So go do that first if that's a problem, and then you can come back to this part after so that we can go look at the individual shares. Moving on. So now we want to go over the creation of multiple shares, which in my opinion is the better setup. It's just not the easier setup. But to do that, in order to be able to access those shares, I actually recommend that you use user-based security. That is the best way. And the first thing you're going to want to do is, instead of being in your shares section here, you're going to want to go in your users section, and you're going to want to set a password for your root account. So that means that when you access your Unraid, your web interface here, it's going to ask you for the password for a root, and that's the only place you ever need to log in as that root user, is to access your Unraid web interface. This prevents, let's say someone hacks your Wi-Fi, or you have guests that you may or may not trust to access your Unraid and not like accidentally change something. So password protect your Unraid web interface by setting a password on the root account. Pretty simple. You just go to your root account here and you set a password, and you're done, right? Secondly, you're going to want to create a user account, username and password, for everyone in your local network who is going to be accessing the shares and using them. So, I've got my own account so that I can copy my projects when I'm done to the RAID array, and my wife has a username so that we're going to have a pictures share that we can both write pictures to, like our honeymoon pictures and just shared family photos, right? So you might have a household where you want multiple family members to be able to write to a shared picture share, but maybe not to some sort of personal or like work-based share. Maybe you've got like tax documents or something that you want to be able to preserve in a share, but you won't necessarily allow everyone to access those shares, right? So user-based is generally the better idea when you're using Unraid, but of course you just got to create your users, and then when you create your shares, you then have to limit access to those shares by user. So now back into the share section. I was mentioning previously that I actually prefer creating shares that are set to private and that require user-based access. By default, Unraid creates all these public shares, and that is not my preference. I don't really want the app data share to be seen on my network. I would rather require a user. If I ever needed to access those shares, I can, but I would rather only the administrators be able to do that. Just to show you how you do that, I'll just show you the app data share. So I'm going to click on the app data share, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom, and under my SMB security settings, I can set the export to yes, and I don't want app data to show up when I'm basically here in this section. I don't want like the app data share to show up. Like, it doesn't make sense that the average user, like if it was a family member, would see app data. They'd be like, what's that? That's not useful information to them. So we want to hide all of the shares except for the ones that are relevant. So I'm going to put export to yes hidden, which means that I can access the share should I ever need to, but it's never going to show up in that browsable set of shares. And I'm going to set the security to private and then click apply. And after I click apply, I can scroll back down, and it's going to add a user section beneath the security section so that I can actually pick and say that my Stefan account has read-write access to this share, and my wife doesn't really need access to that share, so I'm just going to leave that to no access, and then I'm going to click apply. So voila, I now have access to that share if I needed to access it for some reason, and now it says private over here. I'm going to do that with the rest of all of my shares, I'm going to move on from that, and I'll do that later. One last part about security is that you also by default, Unraid's going to share your flash drive that actually has Unraid running on it, and it shares that by default publicly. That's something else that I feel that should also be set to private, just like the other shares that are created default under user shares. So in order to do that, you got to go to your main section where it lists all of your drives, and then you want to go down to the boot device section here, and you're going to want to click on flash here, and then you're going to scroll down, and you've got your normal security section. Just set it to yes hidden or no if you want, and then just set it to private, apply, scroll down as normal, and where's my security here so that only I can access to if I need to. And there you go. So that way, if I ever wanted to set up some sort of backup to my local computer so that I can basically take a copy of the config, I can. But generally speaking, one of the things you have to understand is that user shares or even that particular flash drive share is only for the sake of users accessing that share through the network. Your Unraid server can access all of the files of all of the shares regardless of what your user shares are set to. So by setting your user shares to private and requiring a user to access those shares, Unraid will still be able to access those files because it can directly access it through the Linux server's path, and doesn't actually go through the user share system. So your Docker containers should be able to access those shares by using paths, not user shares. So okay, that's it about security, and let's now move on to the shares that are specific to each media type. Okay, so now we're going to work on the individual shares per media type. So I'm going to click on Add Share here. I'm going to make one for movies. I'm going to leave the allocation high water, which is fine. It'll just allocate the movies to the disks, and it won't fully fill the disk, but it will go from one disk to another based on, I think it does like half the disk, half the disk, half the disk, and it'll keep kind of like rotating through the disks and keep doing that sort of half disk thing. But the more important part is the split level. Now, if you leave it to automatic, then the split level will never override your allocation method, and your allocation method being high water, which means it'll just take your movies, files for your movies, and go from, one disk to another. What could happen there is you could have, let's say, a movie that's in a folder, which is like the title of the movie, right? And then in that folder, you could have multiple files that are related to the movie. It could be like subtitles or something like that. So to keep all of the content in the same disk that's related to that one file, you want to set it to top level. Split only the top level directory as required. So when you do that, all of the files from that one movie will be on the same disk, and it'll follow this pattern that I'm going to show above here that explains, like, the folder structure is usually something like share name, folder, and then the files, folder being the name of the movie. So let's do that. I am going to say that I only want disks 1 and 2 for me. I'm only going to use disk 1 and 2 for my media. I'm going to reserve disk 3 for my projects. And if I ever want to add more data for my projects, because it's only like 1 3 terabyte disk, I can keep adding more disks to the array for it, no problem. And sort of give more space for that share. You can go back to that share and just, include more disks as you add them, and that'll be fine. And the reason I do this is that if my disk 1 or 2 fails, it was just movies and TV shows, I don't care too much. I'd probably just start with clean disks and not care that much. Or I can literally allow, my Plex PVR system to just automatically re-download everything, and it would. But second to that, if my disk 3 fails, which is on my project files, then I'm going to want to restore those for sure. And what I'll do is then I'm always going to keep an external backup of my files. I'm not just going to put all my files on my Unraid NAS and just think that that's good enough, because if my house caught on fire and I lost the NAS, would I have a backup? So it's important to have a backup, and that your NAS should not be considered a backup unless you have a second NAS that's offsite somewhere. Then okay, then your NAS technically is your backup. But that's just to say that you should not rely on your NAS for being a backup. It's a network storage system that, can provide you some functionality of having that network drive, and also allows you to, run Docker containers like Plex and whatnot. It does simplify that process, but it should not be used as a backup system, because you might get disappointed that your backup, you'll lose your backup, or if it's your only backup. So you should usually use a real backup for Unraid. And Unraid has functionality that, you can use a Docker plugin that would actually take, let's say, everything just from disk 3 and back it up every day to the cloud. And then I don't really care about backing up disk 1 and 2. So there are some useful Docker containers that can really simplify and help you get through all of that. So like I said, let's move along. I'm going to leave disk 1 and 2 for my media. So that's going to be both my TV shows and my movies are going to use disk 1 and 2. And then when I copy, use cache disk. So when I copy files to my cache, and that those are basically like movies that let's say I've taken a DVD or a Blu-ray and I've created a rip of the media, and I want to store that in my movie share, because I'd rather have a backup there than rely on pulling the media and putting the media in my computer all the time. I would then just take that rip and I would just put it into my share, right? So in order to speed up the writing of those media files to my share, I'm going to want to enable the cache for my movie share so that it actually writes that large rip to my cache drive. That's going to be way faster, and then just allow it to copy overnight to my RAID array, which is way slower. So I'm just going to say use cache disk, yes. And then every night the mover is going to grab whatever I've moved to my movie share or my TV share, and it's going to move it to the RAID array and not the RAID array, to the array. Unraid means there's no RAID. Anyways, so here we go. I'm going to add share, and I don't want other people in my network to necessarily have free reign access to that share. So I'm gonna leave it yes, because I want the movie share to be like visible in my network, but I won't necessarily want people to be able to like read from my movie share unless I've made them a username and password. So I'm gonna set that to private, click apply, and then I'm gonna say, let's say both me and the wife can have read and write access to that share. That's fine. So let's click apply. And voila, I now have my movie share done. So I'm going to go back to shares, and now you can see here movies. And if I see if I just drop this, grab more share, refresh, I've got movies, and I'm going to access, there's my movie share. So let me do my TV show one now. So I'm going to do add share. I'll call it TV. Allocation high water. That's usually fine. I don't find there's an issue with using high water. Some people like to set up the fill up option, so that way like it fills up one disk and then it fills up the next disk and the next disk, and then like that way you just know how many disks are full, and if there's an empty disk, great. Maybe if that disk failed and it was empty, you'd be like whatever. But I find high water's fine. That way you kind of get an even distribution on the disks, and sometimes disks don't perform as well if they're mostly full, so whatever. I just like high water. I don't feel like there's anything too wrong with that method. But the split level for TV is different, because depending on how you structure your television show, right? Now here's how my flow works here. You can do share name, which is TV, and then the show name, and then the season number, and then all of the episodes. So there's an extra an extra tier deep compared to the movie share. So for the movies, I had done automatically split the top level directory. So that meant it's okay to move movies to other disks, but keep all of the files that are within any level below that together. Let's say I've got a TV show, let's say Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? So let's say I've got Star Trek: The Next Generation, and that I have it set to top level. That means that all of the same disk will contain every episode and related file, and also like all of the seasons of Star Trek TNG would stay on that same disk. If I don't care about every season being on the same disk, but I just want to make sure that all of the files of the same season is on the same disk, then I would use 2 directory levels deep. So that means it would take any files that are under show name, season number, so all of the episodes of that actual season will stay on that same disk. Remember that split level overrides allocation method. So even if the allocation method says, oh, you're almost full on this disk, I want to switch you to another disk to write your files, it won't use that allocation method. The split level has priority over the allocation method, which is why you can always count on all of your files of that season or all of your files of that TV show to be on the same disk. Now that might make management easier if you want to if you lose a disc and you got to figure out which movies you want to restore or which TV shows you want to restore, you'll know which disc died, so you kind of have an idea which one was on there. But nevertheless, the main reason to do this, to have your split level like that, is if you're binge watching a TV show and it goes from episode to episode, it will only spin up the disk that your drives are on, so you'll get less wear and tear on the disks that don't have that TV show on, and then spinning up the disks can actually take a while to warm up the disk, so you might get a little bit of lag. If you've got everything into one share and you have all of your disks added into the one array, and then that way you've got like different episodes that are spread out among different disks, then you might see a little bit of lag going from show to show. As the next show loads up, it'll be like, whoop, why is it taking 5-10 seconds to load? It's because it had to spin up that disk, that mechanical disk, grab the data from that mechanical disk, and then use it. But if it's always using the same disk, then it will always be, it'll be kind of like pre-warmed up because you already started watching the first episode. But this matters less for movies because there's only usually like the one movie file, so it doesn't matter. You should just grab it from whatever disk, play it, and it doesn't matter. But for TV shows, there's how you can see how it could matter, and that for performance reasons and for the longevity of your hard drives, it's generally better for the wear and tear to set up your TV drive like this, with either 1 level deep or 2 levels deep, but as long as you understand how that works. So again, I'm going to use discs 1 and 2 for TV. I'm going to leave disk 3 for my projects, and I'm going to set use cache yes, so that if I rip a TV show from a DVD or Blu-ray, that I can copy it to my TV share and then expect it to find its way to the array the next day. So great, I'm going to click add share, going to set up the security as usual, export yes as usual, and let's set the security to private, and both me and the wife can access it. Great, click done. So now if I go to my shares here, I've got movies and TV. The last part I wanted to cover is a UPS, which I've got this one over here, and it's an APC brand UPS. And why that's interesting is that Unraid already has everything set up correctly to use an APC brand UPS out of the box without you doing pretty much anything. You just plug in your NAS into your UPS, and you plug your UPS into the wall, and then you plug a USB cable from your NAS to your UPS, and then power everything up. And then I went to the settings sections, UPS settings. I set start APC UPS daemon to yes, and I put my UPS cable type to USB and my UPS type to USB. Sometimes you have to play with these depending on which model you got, but for me it was a pretty modern model, and it carries a pretty large load, so I could also have my desktop running on there for a little bit. If I was okay with a 10-minute countdown before everything powered down, I'm sure that would be fine. But as you can see here with just my NAS, it's only got a pretty small load on it, and it says it'll run like for almost 2 hours before it would shut down, so whatever. I have it, the default is actually that it shut itself down when it hits 10% of the battery life or 10 minutes, whichever comes first. But also you can also set it so that it shuts itself down after 60 seconds. So if it triggers that there's a power outage at your house, it will then tell Unraid, just shut yourself down after a minute. And it'll do a graceful shutdown, which is great because when you pull the plug on your NAS without a UPS, when you power it back up, you're going to have to run a parity check, and parity checks take a long time. So in order to prevent that parity check from needing to happen, if you do a graceful shutdown with your UPS doing it automatically for you, then you kind of save that huge amount of time of having to do another parity check. And also if you're in the middle of copying a file to your NAS, then you won't just that file won't get corrupted just because your NAS powered down immediately. You had that little leeway so that it could finish copying your file before it powers down. So that's why you can tweak those settings as to how long you want your NAS to wait before it will power itself down gracefully, right? And there you have it. Have a good one. All right, so here I've got I got my network window here. I browsed to my my NAS, which is called Borg, right here. And then I went to my nerd share, which is configured to write directly to my cache, and that it'll move it to the array later. And then I made a folder called transfer demo, and I'm going to go in that folder, and I've copied some large files on my local hard drive, and now I'm going to paste them here, and then it's going to transfer over the network, and I'm getting just over 1 gigabyte per second, which is just shy of 10 gigabits per second. You divide it by 8, so it's pretty close. There's a little bit of overhead because of the SMB protocol and whatnot, but that's pretty much like that's a really great it's a really great transfer speed. Nothing to be unhappy about that. So there we go. I was able to achieve that using the hardware that I've used and also those few tweaks that I suggested. If you're looking for extra help on configuring MTU and stuff like that, you can let me know in the comments below. I might make a video on specifically that part if there is some demand for that. So let's go to the last part. Okay, so let's say hypothetically that when you go here to your network settings, which you can see by right-clicking on Start and clicking on File Explorer and clicking on Network. So you can see here your computers and that are in your network, right? This is the one that I'm currently using now, and then this is my NAS, right? And if you don't see that NAS in that list, then that could be for a few different reasons. Also, if you do see your NAS, but when you click on here, even though you've set your shares to either public or to, if you set it to yes or to yes hidden, well, I guess you'd have to set it to yes, not yes hidden. If you set it to yes, which means that you're, export yes, which means that you should be able to see your shares here, but you still don't see them even though you've done that. Here's a few of the ways that you can double check that you're configured correctly in Windows to be able to see them. So, first of which is to make sure that your work group of your NAS matches the work group of all of the computers in your network. So the default for Windows is actually to be in a work group called Work Group. And in the Unraid, you can see that by going to your SMB configuration here under Settings. So I went to Settings, SMB, and then it says, yes, my SMB is enabled. It's using the work group. You can scroll down all the way to the work group settings, and it says my work group is called work group. And if it was if my work group that I had set up, I had actually changed it from work group to something else, here's where you'd actually configure your work group to be whatever you've set for your network, right? So you need those two to match. And then once they do match, you're going to have to reboot your computer. You may or may not have to reboot your NAS. If you need to reboot your NAS, make sure you go to your main section and use like the clean power down option or the clean reboot option so that you don't have to run another parity check, because that would take forever. So here we go. The work groups need to match. That's the number one reason why people can't see their shares or can't see their shares, but you can usually see their computers. So anywho, second thing you can check is now the second thing that you're going to want to check for is that your Windows 10 may not actually have the the SMB protocol enabled. It may not be enabled depending on which version of Windows 10 you're using. Type Windows Feature, because you want to go to the part where you can turn Windows Feature on or off, right? So you go here, and this will list all of the features that are enabled on your computer. And then you want to go down to the section here where it says SMB 1.0 file sharing support. Hit the little plus. You want to make sure that your client is that this checkbox is enabled. If not, hit that button and click OK and let it install it. So that'll just make sure that your Windows 10 computer basically has like the drivers installed so that it understands that SMB protocol for being able to see shared folders and other computers in your network and whatnot. So there you go. That's reason number 2 why it could actually have issues. So reason 3 that you don't see the computer or the shares could be that your network discovery is not turned on. So just click on start typing the word sharing, and then you'll have this manage advanced sharing settings. Click on that, which you can always go control panel, network and internet, network sharing settings, advanced sharing settings, like the long way of getting there. But anyways, under private current profile, make sure that turn on network discovery and turn on automatic network of network connected devices. Make sure these two options are turned on and you will be all set. You also want to make sure that file and printer sharing is enabled, which is actually just the next option here. See, file and printer sharing. You want to make sure that that is also turned on. If you're using usernames and passwords to access the shares in your network, as I do, you may also want to turn on, in the same section of the advanced sharing, the turn on password protected sharing option down here, but that's not under private current, it's actually under the all networks, and you want to just do turn on password protected sharing. That could also be another reason why you're having a hard time accessing your shares. So there you go. Those are all the reasons where you may have a problem or a misconfigured option, so that if you're having a hard time accessing, seeing your shares, accessing your shares, seeing your computers in your network, those are all things that you can try to get that to work. And but generally speaking, the workgroup one is the number one reason that people have problems. So there you go. So I've decided to do the Plex and the Docker containers that are related to Plex in a fourth video for this series instead of doing it in this video. This is clearly a long video and has a lot of information for you to go through. So, but if you're planning on setting up Plex and the Docker containers to sort of do like a home-based PVR, you might want to wait for that part 4 to get to that, and I'll walk you through how to do all of that. So wait for that. It shouldn't be too long for me to get that one out. Definitely not as long as it took for part 3 to get out. So have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.